My name is Margaret Sullivan, and at 73, I never imagined I'd be sitting in a courtroom fighting my own children over a piece of paper they tried to hide from me. The judge's hands trembled as he read my late husband's will aloud, and I watched my 3 children's smug expressions crumble into pure panic. They thought they'd outsmarted their foolish old mother. But what they didn't know was that Harold had prepared for their greed in ways that would change everything. Before I reveal the shocking words that made my eldest son collapse in his chair and my daughters burst into tears, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like button if you believe family betrayal cuts the deepest. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in my small apartment in Portland, Maine. 6 months had passed since Harold's funeral, and I was still adjusting to the empty silence where his laughter used to fill our home. My children, Robert, Susan, and Patricia, had been pressuring me about getting my affairs in order, which I thought was their way of showing concern. How naive I was to believe they cared about anything beyond their inheritance. I discovered their deception purely by accident. While cleaning out Harold's study, I found a receipt from Brennan Law Firm dated just 2 weeks after his death. My heart stopped. Harold's lawyer was Gerald Morrison, not this Brennan firm. When I called Gerald's office, his secretary's nervous pause told me everything. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've been trying to reach you. Your children told us you were too grief-stricken to handle the will reading." That evening, I sat in my kitchen, the receipt shaking in my arthritic hands, as the full weight of their betrayal settled over me. My own flesh and blood had conspired to hide their father's final wishes from me. The same children I'd nursed through fevers and heartbreaks had decided I wasn't worthy of knowing what my husband of 51 years had written in his will. But Harold, my clever Harold, had anticipated this moment in ways none of us could have imagined. Harold and I built our life together in a modest 2-story colonial house on Elm Street in Portland's quiet Deering neighborhood. For 5 decades, that house witnessed everything. Birthday parties with handmade decorations, Thanksgiving dinners where Harold insisted on carving the turkey despite my protests about his technique, and quiet evenings on the porch swing watching the seasons change. We weren't wealthy by any means, but Harold's job as a senior engineer at the shipyard and my work as a school librarian provided a comfortable life. Our 3 children grew up wanting for nothing essential. Robert, our eldest, inherited Harold's analytical mind, but none of his humility. Even as a boy, he'd count his Halloween candy and hide the best pieces from his sisters. Susan, the middle child, mastered the art of manipulation early, always playing Harold and me against each other to get her way. Patricia, our youngest, seemed the sweetest but harbored a cold, calculating nature beneath her dimpled smile. The changes started subtly after Harold's retirement 5 years ago. Suddenly, our children's visits became less about seeing us and more about assessing our assets. Robert would casually ask about our investment accounts while fixing himself coffee. Susan Patterson, she'd kept her married name after her divorce, would comment on how valuable the neighborhood had become, her eyes scanning our living room like an appraiser. Patricia started photographing our antiques, claiming she wanted to preserve memories, though I caught her researching prices online. Harold noticed too. One evening, after Robert had spent an entire Sunday dinner discussing reverse mortgages, Harold took my hand and said, "Maggie, they're watching us like hawks, aren't they?" We laughed then, but I saw the hurt in his eyes. The man who'd worked double shifts to pay for their college educations, who'd walked Susan down the aisle at her wedding, who'd bailed Robert out of his failed business ventures, that man was watching his children reduce him to a potential inheritance. 3 years before his death, Harold started meeting regularly with Gerald Morrison, updating our estate planning to ensure I'd be protected. I trusted him completely, never asking for details. The pattern of my children's disregard became undeniable after Harold's diagnosis of lung cancer 2 years ago. Within days of receiving the devastating news, Robert arrived with a briefcase full of documents. "We need to get Dad's affairs in order while he's still lucid," he announced, as if Harold were already gone. I found him in Harold's study that night, photographing financial statements with his phone. When I confronted him, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "Someone needs to be practical, Mother," he said, using that condescending tone he'd perfected in his corporate job. Susan Patterson's approach was more insidious. She'd visit during Harold's chemotherapy sessions, not to support him, but to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to manage alone. "Mom, you've never handled the finances. Maybe we should set up a joint account just in case." When I refused, she'd exchange meaningful looks with her siblings, as if my desire to maintain independence was proof of senility. She even suggested I might be showing early signs of confusion when I couldn't immediately locate a receipt she demanded to see. Patricia played the role of the caring daughter, but her performance had cracks. She'd bring homemade soup, then spend her entire visit asking about Harold's life insurance policies. Once I overheard her on the phone in our bathroom, telling someone, "The house alone is worth at least $500,000 in this market." The casual cruelty of discussing our home's value while Harold lay dying in the next room still takes my breath away. The only person who showed genuine kindness during those dark months was Dorothy Chen, our next-door neighbor of 30 years. While my children calculated their future wealth, Dorothy sat with me during Harold's bad days. She'd bring tea and simply listen as I shared memories of better times. "Your children should be ashamed," she said one afternoon after witnessing Susan pressure me about power of attorney. Harold, despite his weakness, was documenting everything. He'd asked Dorothy to witness conversations, had her son Marcus help him record family dinners, and kept meticulous notes about each child's behavior. "For your protection, Maggie," he'd whisper when I questioned why. I thought it was the medication making him paranoid. I should have known my brilliant husband was building a case. The catalyst came exactly 1 week after Harold's funeral. I was still in that numb fog of early grief, moving through days on autopilot, when Robert called a family meeting at my house. They arrived together, dressed in business attire, as if attending a corporate merger rather than comforting their widowed mother. Robert carried a leather portfolio, Susan had her tablet ready, and Patricia clutched a folder marked "Estate Planning" in red ink. "Mother, we need to discuss the will," Robert announced before they'd even removed their coats. "We've taken the liberty of scheduling a reading with Dad's lawyer for next month. You don't need to worry about anything. We'll handle all the details." The presumption in his voice made my stomach turn. These weren't my children offering support. They were executors preparing to divide assets. "I'd like to be involved in planning the reading," I said quietly. The look they exchanged, quick but loaded with meaning, sent a chill through me. Susan reached across the kitchen table, patting my hand with false sympathy. "Mom, you're grieving. Let us handle these complicated matters. You just focus on healing." Her tone suggested I was a child incapable of understanding adult concerns. Patricia pulled out a document from her folder. "We've prepared a preliminary inventory of assets. We'll need you to sign this authorization so we can access Dad's accounts and start the probate process." I stared at the paper, legal terms swimming before my eyes. Something felt deeply wrong. "Shouldn't Harold's lawyer be handling this?" I asked. Robert's jaw tightened. "Morrison is traditional. We found someone more efficient at Brennan Law Firm." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly amiss. I called Gerald Morrison's office first thing the next morning. What I learned shattered my already broken heart. My children had contacted him the day after Harold's death, claiming I was too distraught to handle any legal matters. They'd scheduled a will reading without informing me, presenting themselves as my legal representatives. Gerald, alarmed by their behavior, had refused to proceed without my presence. That's when they'd hired Brennan Law Firm, someone willing to work with them behind my back. "Mrs. Sullivan," Gerald said gently, "Harold was very specific about his wishes. He made me promise to deliver his will directly to you, and only you." Sitting alone in my kitchen after Gerald's revelation, I faced the hardest decision of my life. The mother in me wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding, that my children were simply misguided in their grief. But the evidence was damning. They'd lied to Harold's lawyer, hired their own attorney, and tried to manipulate me into signing away my rights. The receipt from Brennan Law Firm wasn't an innocent mistake. It was proof of a calculated plan to exclude me from my own husband's will reading. I spent that sleepless night weighing my options. I could confront them directly, but they'd already shown their willingness to deceive. They might destroy evidence or accelerate their plans. I could simply show up at their secret will reading, but Gerald had warned me that any will reading without my knowledge would be legally questionable. Or I could take the path Harold would have chosen, the strategic one. I decided to play the role they'd cast me in, the confused, grieving widow who needed their help. The next morning, I called Robert. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told him, letting my voice waver. "You're right. This is all too much for me. Please handle everything." His relief was audible through the phone. "That's very wise, Mother. We only want what's best for you." I agreed to sign their papers, agreed to stay home from any legal proceedings, agreed to trust them completely. The lies tasted bitter, but Harold had taught me that sometimes strategic retreat was necessary before victory. My next call was to Dorothy Chen. If I was going to fight my children's deception, I needed an ally they wouldn't suspect. Dorothy listened to the whole sordid story without interruption, her usually cheerful face growing stormier with each detail. "Those ungrateful wretches," she muttered. "After everything you and Harold did for them." I asked her to quietly gather information, to be my eyes and ears. Her son Marcus was a private investigator, and she promised to engage his services discreetly. Within days, Marcus had uncovered disturbing details. My children had been planning this for months before Harold's death, researching elder law and conservatorship requirements. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined, but it also steeled my resolve. Harold had prepared for their greed. Now I had to be strong enough to see his plan through. The following weeks tested every ounce of strength I possessed. Playing the role of the feeble, grieving widow while secretly building my case required constant vigilance. Each interaction with my children became a performance. When Susan visited, I'd deliberately misplace my glasses or forget her ex-husband's name, feeding her narrative of my declining competence. When Robert called about urgent financial matters, I'd defer to his judgment while carefully documenting every conversation. Patricia received tearful phone calls about how lost I felt without Harold, never suspecting I was recording her callous responses. Behind the scenes, I was far from idle. Gerald Morrison became my legal champion, appalled by my children's actions. We met secretly at Dorothy's house, poring over documents and building our strategy. Harold's will, Gerald revealed, was ironclad and witnessed by 3 respected community members. My children's attempt to circumvent it wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Harold started preparing this 3 years ago, Gerald admitted. He called it his insurance policy against greed. The emotional toll was crushing. Every night I'd lie in the bed Harold and I had shared for decades, crying not just for his loss, but for the children we'd raised. Where had we gone wrong? How had our babies become these calculating strangers? I found myself going through old photo albums, searching for signs we'd missed. There was Robert at 10, hoarding his Easter candy. Susan at 15, lying about where she'd spent her babysitting money. Patricia at 12, secretly reading her sister's diary for blackmail material. The signs had always been there. Love had simply made us blind. Marcus Chen's investigation revealed more disturbing details. My children had been in contact with a nursing home, exploring options for when mom needs care. They'd had the house appraised without my knowledge. Susan had researched how to break a trust, suggesting Harold might have protected assets they couldn't easily access. The hardest moments came during family dinners I still hosted out of habit and strategy. Sitting at the table Harold had built, serving his favorite pot roast, listening to my children discuss their plans while pretending concern. It was agony. But I endured, drawing strength from Harold's memory and the knowledge that justice was coming. My salvation during those dark months came from the most unexpected sources. Dorothy Chen transformed from concerned neighbor to fierce protector, checking on me daily and running interference when my children's visits became too overwhelming. Her son Marcus refused payment for his investigative work, saying, "Mrs. Sullivan, watching your kids try to con you makes me appreciate my own mother more. Consider this my good deed." His findings would prove crucial in the legal battle ahead. At the grocery store, I encountered Helen Watts, a woman from my book club, whom I'd barely known beyond our monthly discussions of mystery novels. She'd overheard Susan loudly discussing my declining mental state with another shopper. Helen marched right up to her and said, "Your mother runs circles around women half her age in our book club. Perhaps you're the one with perception problems." Later, Helen called to offer her support, revealing she'd gone through something similar with her own children. "Money brings out the worst in people," she said bluntly. Gerald Morrison went above and beyond his duties as Harold's lawyer. He connected me with Dr. Sarah Evanston, a renowned geriatric psychiatrist who agreed to evaluate my mental competence. "I want documentation that you're sharper than all three of your children combined," Gerald explained. Dr. Evanston's evaluation was thorough and unequivocal. Not only was I completely competent, but my cognitive function tested above average for someone 20 years younger. "Grief doesn't equal incompetence," she told me. "Your children should be ashamed." The most surprising ally came from within my own family. My daughter-in-law Claire, Robert's wife, called me one evening in tears. "I can't stand what they're doing to you," she confessed. "Robert thinks I don't know about their plan, but I've seen the emails. I've heard the conference calls. It's eating me alive." Claire became my inside source, forwarding me copies of their communications and warning me of their next moves. Her courage in standing up to her husband gave me hope that decency still existed in my family. Even Harold's old colleagues from the shipyard rallied around me. Tom Morrison organized a dinner in Harold's memory and made a point of loudly discussing how Harold had always praised my financial acumen. "Maggie kept the books for our union meetings," he announced. "Sharpest treasure we ever had." Armed with evidence and supported by my unexpected allies, I began my counteroffensive. The first step was financial independence. I quietly moved half of the joint savings account Harold and I had shared into a new account at a different bank, one my children didn't know about. When Robert called furious about the missing money, I played confused. "Oh dear, Harold must have done that. You know how private he was about finances." His frustrated sputtering told me he couldn't challenge this without revealing he'd been illegally monitoring my accounts. Next, I had the locks changed on the house, citing security concerns after strange cars in the neighborhood. In reality, I discovered Patricia had made copies of our keys and had been entering when I was out, photographing valuables and searching for financial documents. The locksmith, a kind young man named Jeremy, installed a security system at a discount after I explained my situation. "Nobody should feel unsafe in their own home," he said, shooting a disgusted look at Patricia's car parked across the street. I also began documenting everything meticulously. Every conversation, every visit, every attempted manipulation went into a journal I kept hidden in Dorothy's house. Gerald advised me to email myself summaries of each interaction, creating a digital trail with timestamps. When Susan tried to gaslight me about a conversation we'd had, I could reference my notes and watch her squirm. "Your memory seems quite good for someone supposedly suffering from confusion," she snapped once, not realizing she'd just undermined her own narrative. The turning point came when I accidentally let slip to Patricia that I was considering updating my own will. The panic in her eyes was almost comical. Within hours, all 3 children were at my door, suddenly concerned about my emotional state and insisting I shouldn't make any major decisions while grieving. I served them tea in Harold's favorite china, the set they'd already mentally divided among themselves, and assured them I was just thinking ahead. "After all," I said innocently, "you've taught me the importance of having affairs in order." By November, 6 months after Harold's death, my children's scheme was unraveling. Their lawyer at Brennan grew uncomfortable after receiving a carefully worded letter from Gerald about potential fraud charges. The stage was set for Harold's final move. As December approached, the threads of deception began to tangle around my children's feet. Their carefully orchestrated plan was crumbling, and desperation made them reckless. Robert showed up one evening with a new lawyer, insisting I needed proper representation for the will reading. When I mentioned I already had Gerald Morrison, he exploded. "Morrison is old-fashioned. He doesn't understand modern estate law." The real issue, of course, was that Gerald couldn't be bought or manipulated. Susan tried a different approach, arriving with brochures for luxury assisted living facilities. "Just to have options," she cooed, spreading glossy pictures across my kitchen table. "This one has a wonderful memory care unit." The implication was clear: cooperate or find yourself declared incompetent. I smiled sweetly and told her I'd already toured several places with Dorothy, just to be prepared. The lie sent her into a texting frenzy with her siblings that Claire promptly reported to me. Patricia made the crucial mistake. In her eagerness to inventory my assets, she broke into Harold's locked study while I was at a doctor's appointment. What she didn't know was that Jeremy had installed a hidden camera at my request. I watched the footage that evening with a mixture of sadness and vindication as my youngest daughter rifled through Harold's papers, photographed documents, and even pocketed a few valuable coins from his collection. It was the evidence that would prove criminal intent. The formal will reading was scheduled for December 15th at the Cumberland County Courthouse. My children had pushed for a private reading at Brennan Law Firm's office, but Gerald had insisted on a formal proceeding given the unusual circumstances. I received my official notice, though my children didn't know that. They continued their charade, with Robert calling to say he'd handle everything, and I needn't trouble myself with attending. "We'll tell you everything afterward," he promised. I agreed meekly, all while confirming my attendance with the court. The night before the reading, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Harold's chair, wrapped in the quilt his mother had made for our wedding, and talked to him as if he were there. "I hope I've been strong enough," I whispered to his photograph. "I hope I've done what you wanted." At dawn, I dressed carefully in the navy suit Harold had loved, pinned on the pearl brooch he'd given me for our 40th anniversary, and prepared to face whatever revelations the day would bring. The Cumberland County Courthouse in Portland was bustling with typical Monday morning activity, but Courtroom 3 had been reserved for our proceeding. I arrived early with Gerald and Dorothy, taking a seat in the front row. My children arrived 15 minutes later, their confident chatter dying as they spotted me. The shock on Robert's face was almost worth everything I'd endured. "Mother? What are you doing here?" he stammered. I simply smiled and said, "Attending my husband's will reading, dear." Judge Martha Blackwood, a stern woman with silver hair and penetrating eyes, called the proceeding to order. She noted the unusual circumstances that had necessitated a formal reading, her gaze lingering disapprovingly on my children. Gerald presented Harold's will, sealed and witnessed according to all legal requirements. As the judge broke the seal, I noticed Susan gripping Patricia's hand, their knuckles white with tension. Robert sat rigid, his jaw clenched, already calculating how to contest whatever provisions didn't favor him. "Before I read Mr. Sullivan's last will and testament," Judge Blackwood announced, "I must address the attempted fraud perpetrated by the deceased's children." The word fraud hit like a thunderbolt. She continued, "Mr. Sullivan anticipated this situation and provided extensive documentation to prevent any manipulation of his wishes." She held up a thick folder that Gerald had submitted, Harold's insurance policy against greed. The judge began reading Harold's words. "I, Harold James Sullivan, being of sound mind and heavy heart, must address the betrayal I foresee from my children upon my death. For the past 3 years, I have documented their increasing greed and disregard for their mother's well-being. I have recorded conversations, saved emails, and maintained evidence of their character. This will is my final act of protection for my beloved wife, Margaret, who deserves better than the children we raised." Robert shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. Dad wasn't in his right mind." Judge Blackwood's gavel cracked sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Sullivan, or you'll be held in contempt. Your father provided 3 independent psychiatric evaluations confirming his mental competence, dated over a 2-year period." As Robert sank back into his chair, I saw the first crack in his composure. Beside him, Susan had gone pale, while Patricia began to cry, though I suspected her tears were more for her vanishing inheritance than for shame. Judge Blackwood continued reading Harold's will, each word a carefully placed blow against our children's greed. "To my son Robert, who values money above family, I leave the sum of 30 silver dollars, 1 for each piece of silver Judas received. May he finally understand the biblical reference." Robert's face flushed crimson as scattered gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's lips twitched slightly before she continued with complete professional composure. "To my daughter Susan Patterson, who measures love in dollar signs, I leave my collection of accounting textbooks and a calculator, so she can continue to tally what she believes she's owed by the world." Susan's carefully composed facade cracked, tears of rage streaming down her face. "To Patricia, my youngest, who smiled while scheming, I leave the family photo albums. Perhaps reviewing them will remind her of when she had a heart." The symbolic bequests were devastating in their precision, but Harold wasn't finished. The judge read on. "The remainder of my estate, our home, all financial accounts, investments, and personal property, I leave to my devoted wife, Margaret Eleanor Sullivan, with the following provision. Should any of my children contest this will or continue their campaign to harm their mother, a trust fund of $500,000 will be activated to pursue legal action against them for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted theft." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. My children sat frozen, their grand plans reduced to ashes. But Harold had saved his masterstroke for last. "Furthermore," Judge Blackwood continued, "I have established the Harold and Margaret Sullivan Foundation with an initial endowment of $300,000. This foundation will provide legal assistance to elderly parents facing financial abuse from their children. My wife shall serve as the primary trustee with full discretion over distributions." "This can't be legal!" Susan shrieked, jumping to her feet. "We're his children! We have rights!" Judge Blackwood removed her glasses, fixing Susan with a stern glare. "Ms. Patterson, you have no inherent right to your parents' assets. Furthermore, the evidence submitted shows a clear pattern of attempted elder abuse. Consider yourself fortunate that Mrs. Sullivan hasn't pressed criminal charges yet." The judge then added, "There's also the matter of breaking and entering, theft, and fraud that could be pursued." Patricia visibly shrank in her seat, realizing the camera footage could send her to jail. 6 months after that dramatic day in court, I sat on my porch swing, the same one where Harold and I had spent countless evenings, reflecting on how much had changed. The house felt peaceful again, no longer contaminated by my children's scheming presence. Robert had moved to California, his marriage to Claire ending when she refused to support his continued vendetta. Susan had reluctantly accepted defeat after her lawyer explained the legal ramifications of pursuing baseless claims. Patricia sent one letter of apology before disappearing entirely, perhaps finally understanding the gravity of her actions. The Harold and Margaret Sullivan Foundation had already helped 12 families facing similar situations. Each case broke my heart anew. Elderly parents betrayed by children they'd loved and sacrificed for, reduced to fighting for their dignity in their twilight years. But each victory, each protected parent, felt like Harold's hand still guiding good in the world. Dorothy Chen joined the board, bringing her fierce advocacy and her son Marcus's investigative skills to our mission. Claire and I maintained a warm relationship separate from Robert. She'd shown true courage in standing against her husband's greed, and I refused to punish her for his sins. She visited monthly with my grandchildren, slowly building the relationship that should have existed all along. "I want them to know the real you," Claire told me, "not the villain their father painted." Watching my grandchildren play in the same yard where their father had learned to walk gave me hope for redemption through the next generation. The most unexpected development came from Harold's family. His brother James, whom we'd lost touch with years earlier, reached out after hearing about the will reading. "Harold told me he was worried," James confided. "He said the kids were acting like vultures. I should have done more to support you both." We rekindled our friendship, and I learned Harold had confided in James extensively, seeking advice on protecting me. Even from beyond, my husband was still taking care of me. On quiet evenings, I often found myself talking to Harold's photograph, updating him on the foundation's work and the strange turns our life had taken. The pain of our children's betrayal had dulled to a manageable ache, overshadowed by the pride I felt in honoring Harold's legacy. He'd known I was strong enough to face this trial, had trusted me to stand firm against our children's greed. In his final act of love, he'd ensured not just my financial security, but my dignity. To anyone facing family who value inheritance over relationships, I offer this wisdom: document everything. Trust your instincts. Build support beyond blood relations. And remember, you don't owe anyone access to your life or assets simply because they share your DNA. Harold saw our children clearly when I was blinded by maternal love. His final gift wasn't just the money or the house. It was the truth that freed me from guilt. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is knowing when to protect those we cherish from those who would harm them, even when they share our name.